So I want to welcome everyone to the discussion today, Land as Art, Creative Research in Land-Based Materiality and Concepts. I'll be facilitating today. My name is Tania Willard. I am of Secwépemc and settler ancestry. I'm an artist, curator, and assistant professor in creative studies with UBCO Okanagan in Syilx territories. I'm joining you today from my home territories in Secwépemc Utlûq. Indigenous contemporary art practice often highlights relationships to land, territory, and home within more than a context of being place-based. Indigenous territories and the ways in which artists draw upon it, from the material to the performative, the emotive, and the conceptual. Artists Maureen Gruben, Tanya Lukin Linklater, and Kablusiak, all joining me today, discuss the specificity of the North as home, land, and territory, and draw out these relationships in their work and research. Today, our panel is being co-presented by Dechinta Center for Research and Learning, as well as NAISA North, a program of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, and UBCO Okanagan's Indigenous Art Intensive. So I want to welcome you all here today and those who are joining us in virtual lands. And we're going to start out with having each of our artists, who I'm so excited could join us here today, will present briefly on their work, and then we'll join together in some discussion. And so first it's my honor to introduce Inuvialuit artist Maureen Gruben. Maureen Gruben employs an intimate materiality in her practice: polar bear fur, beluga intestines, seal skins, encounter resins, vinyl, bubble wrap, and metallic tape, forging critical links between life in the Western Arctic and global environmental and cultural concerns. Gruben was born and raised in Tuktoyaktuk, where her parents were traditional knowledge keepers and founders of E. Gruben's Transport. She holds a BFA from the University of Victoria and has exhibited regularly across Canada and internationally. She was longlisted for the 2019 Aesthetica Art Prize and the 2021 Sobey Art Prize, and her work is held in national and private collections. And I'm going to share my screen for the images that Maureen will share with us today. Sorry, just give me one moment to set those up. And please welcome Maureen. Thank you, Maureen, for joining us today.
Tanya, for inviting me to this wonderful visit with amazing artists. It's always nice to gather together and talk about what we're doing and how we connect with the land. With this cedar line piece, it was just an impromptu kind of work that was in between hockey games. Actually, it was my son going to a hockey game on the island, Victoria Island. And so I was just waiting in the parking lot, and there was a stockpile of cedar shavings. So I just started making a line that went up the hill. And we were there for about an hour because my adopted son was in the skate park, and then it was time to go. So it didn't last very long. I was only there for maybe a little less than an hour, and it was time to get back to the arena. So yeah, land art can be done anywhere, anytime, and just work with what's around you. So that's where Cedar Line came from, and that was in 2017, so it was quite a while ago. And then this one was done right out my backyard here on the Arctic Ocean, and it's called Moving with Joy. Moving with joy across the ice as my face turns brown from the sun, where I gathered together 14 sleds from the community and stood them upright out on the ice. And to me, it represents community and our ancestral ways of moving, and which we still do today, and it's happening actually right now as I speak, that we're going back and forth out to Imarliok, Husky Lakes, and enjoying the land. So yeah, this was sleds from individual families, and when you put them together, we're like a community. So that's where that piece came from. And this one was actually curated by you, Tanya, and that was in 2017 as well, where I took, it must have been over 1,000 feet of red broadcloth and split the rolls and created 3 balls of thread and went along the old ice road, which was the last ice road in our community, because now we have an all-weather access road, and we don't see the ice road anymore. That was the last year that it was built, and this piece was created over a part of the ice that was the ice road that was blown in after a blizzard, which was no longer used. And yeah, there's 111 ice fishing holes that were connected with this red broadcloth. And the next one, this piece was in 2021, I believe, last year, or 2020. And I was gifted these 3 deteriorating polar bear rugs from UBC, or was it UBC? No, it was Philip. Right. Do you remember where the rugs were gifted from? Right. The polar bear rugs.
It was from the Museum of Anthropology.
Oh, from MOA. Sorry about that. And yeah, she thought of how I'm using raw materials, so she gifted them to me, and I brought them home. And I'm always looking at abandoned buildings or the garbage dump for materials, and there was these 3 survey posts. So I brought those out with the polar bears onto the freshly frozen ice. Kira and I did, my assistant that comes and writes about my work and photographs my work. And yeah, so we set up these bear rugs out there and left them overnight. And it was the time of the first freeze up. So the water would come up and go down, and it would freeze in layers. So you see all the layers of ice around each post. And then the water actually pulled on the bears and the ice, and like grabbed the bottom and kind of pulled them up so that they were now facing the stars. And which was so much better. Like, thank goodness nature helped me along with my work. I thought it was much better after it was in the environment for a few days. So this one's called Aidainakdoni, meaning we are finally home. Next one. This is the most recent one that I've done, and it's still out there on the ice. It's 28 feet by 56 feet, and it's of a Red Cross. And I'm working here with a youth group who have formed a little committee called a Tuck TV Film Committee, and I believe they're working on issues of climate change. And they did a little film called Happening to Us, which is an amazing short little film. And it's all done here in TAC. So there was a couple of film directors that came in, and they've worked with the youth before. So they brought some youth out to the ice, and they helped me to unravel all this thread, which was from stitching my landscape that I saved, and I sewed it all back together and created this big Red Cross. bringing attention to the eroding coastline and the melting of the ice and the crisis of our community, where we're having to move our homes further inland because of the quickly receding coastline. So yeah, that's my land art that I've done, or most of them. I think there's a couple more, but I thought that was enough to show.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maureen, for that brief but engaging discussion with your work, which touches on so many critical both relations to the land as well as realities, I think, of climate change and how that's shifting. And thank you for the beauty of that presentation. I want to invite Tanya Lukin Linklater to share a bit about her work. Tanya Lukin Linklater's performances, works for camera, installations, and writings center histories of Indigenous peoples' lives, lands, and structures of sustenance. Her performances in relation to objects in exhibition, scores, and ancestral belongings generate what she has come to call felt structures. In 2022, she's participating in the Aichi Triennial and the Toronto Biennial of Art. Tanya's work has been shown at the 2021 New Museum Triennial, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2019, and Art Gallery of Ontario and elsewhere. Her Alutiiq, Secwépemc homelands are in southwestern Alaska, where much of her family continues to live. Thank you so much, Tanya, and please correct any of my pronunciations. Thank you for joining us.
Well, Quiana, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, Tanya, and to have sort of ongoing visits that we've been undertaking over time. I'm going to share my screen and show images of a work that I'm not speaking directly to in what I'm sharing, but I feel as though it addresses some of these questions that you're raising. And sometimes it takes me a while to be able to speak to a specific work. And so I'm just going to share images of this moment and endurance to the end forever. And then also I will speak alongside of it. So I live in diaspora to my homelands, my Secwépemc, and that's the northern dialect of Kodiak Island, Secwépemc or Alutiiq homelands, the native villages of Afognak and Port Lions and the Kodiak archipelago of southwestern Alaska. I've lived and worked in Nipissing and Anishinaabeg territory for over a decade and not quite 15 years, but I also lived in Treaty 6 territory for almost a decade. And my experiences in these different Anishinaabeg and Cree communities and territories has also informed my thinking, writing, and artistic practice. And when I consider homeland, I think a great deal about being an island person and how we have lived in this very specific geography for multiple millennia of rock formations, volcanic ash, ocean, and the sky which carries storms to us regularly. I've been thinking about this marine, terrestrial, and atmospheric place that is Kodiak Island, and my mind is with the weather. In my language, the word for weather is tla, and there are many different sorts of meanings and nuances of meaning for this word, but I'm not going to speak to that today. So my mind is with the weather. Tla organizes us. We are in relation to tla. We observe tla's ever-changing continuousness. We come to read tla's signals over a lifetime, over many lifetimes, attuned, listening, looking. This is the tla that endures, that is before and will continue beyond. My meridians, energy clusters, or small suns beneath the skin, the weather of the body, is with tla. My consciousness, heart, and breath are with tla. Secwépemc were especially equipped to weather storms. Our rain gut parkas, sewn watertight, were attached to kayaks built from driftwood and the bodies of sea mammals to the specifications of our bodies. The designs of the kayaks' bows ensured their maneuverability in choppy seawaters surrounding our archipelago home. Our bentwood hunting hats, a technology to shield us from the sun's glare on imak and to notify us through sound if the wind quickened, alerting us to potential incoming storms. These ancestral technologies allowed us to live with the changing weather. We were both protected from yet immersed within the weather. Our lives were with Tla. In an account by Alutiiq Shukpiaq elder Barbara Shanagan, Alutit or Shukpiat continued to weather the ongoing storms of colonialisms. This weather is different. I first encountered this reflection by Barbara Shanagan in the publication that accompanies the exhibition, Looking Both Ways, Heritage and Identity of the Alutiiq People, in 2001. The exhibition and text were a turning point for our people of Kodiak Island, a moment that documented our ongoing efforts of cultural work with contributions by Alutiiq elders, writers, thinkers, and community members. Later, I tracked this quote as it became belabored in an epilogue in cultural studies writer and scholar James Clifford's book, Returns, Becoming Indigenous in the 21st Century. And despite Clifford's lengthy deconstruction and meandering acceptance of Barbara Shanagan's statement, I take it to heart. Clifford's initial reading of our elders' observation of history, time, and relations is that she is possibly reproducing a cliché. In Clifford's description of Shanagan's observation, he expresses reluctance to accept her experience and eventually gives credence to this metaphor of Alutiiq or Shukpiaq life. This is often what it means to be Alutiiq or Shukpiaq. Our ideas and experiences are reduced or contained, oftentimes erased and sometimes reluctantly accepted in part. Our tone or the feeling of an idea or event is dismissed. It is this dismissal that we are accustomed to, this dismissal, a refusal of our lived experiences and consciousness as Alutiiq or Shukpiat. Yet our elder Barbara Shanagan's observation reminds us that Alutiiq Shukpiat continue to endure violences heaped upon us in our homelands that were not of our making. She expresses time that extends to our ancestors and to the future. She shares with us that our peoples have withstood ongoing storms of colonialisms. The residue of the experience stays with us, felt later, yet the storms will pass and we will rest. In this way, she is hopeful. So I have to say that I am addressing the difficulty of violence and imperialisms and colonialisms. I try to speak in a way that is ethical and is not harmful, but I do want to just give folks a heads up. These violences are not inevitable. Indigenous death is not unavoidable. Indigenous grief is not unpreventable. Indigenous dispossession is not unstoppable. These relentless weather patterns or storms of colonialisms battering our shores and our peoples are a series of human-constructed events rooted in dehumanization and desire for land and resources, including fur-bearing animals, brought to the brink of extinction. These Russian and later American imperial actions became ongoing patterns of violence towards Alutiiq or Shukpiat, our homelands, and more than human or non-human relatives. The weather is a consistent metaphor in Alaska Native life. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it has been described by public health researchers as a weathering event. A disproportionate number of Alaska Native and Native American parents have died from COVID, leaving untold numbers of children orphaned. And as reported in the Washington Post in late 2021, limited research shows experiencing multiple losses. The repeated shock to the system can lead to stress so corrosive it changes bodies. Stress is a physiological reaction, hardwired. At the first sign of danger, the brain sounds an alarm, setting off a torrent of neurological and hormonal signals that flood the bloodstream. Overexposure to those hormones wears down the body, causing it to become sicker and age quicker or weather. The pandemic is a weathering event. according to Thomas Leviste, the Dean of the Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. Alaska Native peoples' weathering due to loss and grief exacerbated by the pandemic is expressed by Cynthia Ivan, a Yupik woman. And so this is also a part of the Washington Post article. She describes the death of her grandmother, and the journalist Akila Johnson writes that Cynthia Ivan explains, quote, her death meant the loss of something more existential, Yuyurak. It's the way of a human being, or how a person should be. From when we're very young, we're taught how to be a person, how to respect a person. It's not something you can be told. You have to watch how she loved, end quote. My mind is with the weather, with cloud, with rain, with wind, with breath, with sweat and voice. Whether we weather, whether we become weathered, whether my mind is with Tla or the weather, I am turning. I'm turning towards tides, winds, clouds, rainfall. Tla extends before and after the ongoing human-constructed storms of colonialisms, weather patterns that weather us. And I wanted to just read a very brief event score that I feel speaks to this specifically, this idea of weathering, but perhaps not directly. Shuk, a human being, a Fognak dialect, the S is pronounced sh. It sounds like shook, but with a shorter O. Perhaps we shake, or past tense, we shook. When are we shaken? An Alutiiq person enters and says, our memory marks a Fognak marks us. What are we tethered to? What holds us together? When I am home on our island, I sense that the land exudes grief, this feeling. Many of us have left the land of our ancestors, perhaps because the grief becomes unbearable. Shuk, a human being, a Fognak dialect, the S is pronounced sh. It sounds like shook, but with a shorter O. Perhaps we shake, or past tense we shook. When are we shaken? So just to end, I just want to share that I write broadly, and over time I've witnessed Indigenous artists and intellectuals speak and write, and elders, so that violences are not reinscripted through display. Yet I acknowledge these histories, these constructed weather patterns, these storms of colonialisms and their legacy in our lives, so that they're not left unsaid, so that our continuance, our insistence as Secwépemc or Alutiiq peoples is contextualized within the endurance of our ancestors. The weather patterns are encoded and the violences are not always readable. Sometimes we cannot sense the signals. In other moments, we forecast them. At times, we find refuge and rest. In other moments, we meet roiling seas head on. And we let them rest now. Hui shuk, but what I speak of is shared by my community and others. So, Koyana, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you for that really moving talk, reading, and sharing that you offered. I want to invite Kablusiak next to share a bit about Kablusiak's work. Kablusiak is a renowned multidisciplinary Inuvialuit artist and curator who uses Inuk ingenuity to create work in a variety of mediums, including but not limited to lingerie, white flour, soapstone, permanent marker, bed sheets, felt, acrylic paint, and words. Their work explores the disconnections between existence in Inuit diaspora while maintaining family and community ties, the impacts of colonization on Inuit gender and sexuality expressions, as well as on health and well-being and the everyday. Kablusiak holds a BFA in drawing from the Alberta University of the Arts in Mohkinstsis. And again, please feel free to correct my pronunciation in your discussions. I took notes from Tanya's talk. Thank you again. Where they are currently based. Kablusiak is currently based. In 2021, Kablusiak was part of a team of 4 Inuit curators who curated the inaugural exhibition. I'm going to let you share the title. I wasn't able to go. It was an amazing exhibition entitled Inua for the new gallery. In all of their creative work, Kablusiak seeks to demystify Inuit art and create the space for Inuit-led representation of the diverse aspects of Inuit cultures. Kablusiak's work can be found in the collections of the Indigenous Arts Centre, the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, the Art Gallery of Alberta, Banff Centre for Arts Creativity, and Global Affairs Visual Art Collection, among others. And I want to invite Kablusiak to share a presentation on their work, and then we'll join together in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. It's been so beautiful to hear Maureen and Tanya about your works. Like, it's very moving and like almost to the point where I have to like shut my brain off to be like, I can't take this in because it's too beautiful and it's like too heartbreaking. So I've been doing that a lot lately. So let me just shut that down and compartmentalize. But yes, let me share my screen from my iPad. Let me try to figure it out here. So I was thinking about this topic, land as art, and I thought of like an ongoing photo series that I started in 2016. And then I thought about this public artwork installation that I think it opened last year or 2 years ago. Time isn't real. But yeah, I figured it would be good to talk about the Ghost series because it kind of makes the most sense and is sort of fitting. I feel like I've talked a lot about these works in general, and they've been like pretty widely exhibited, but I think it's like when I think about land and art and you know, the intersections, it's kind of always been a part of my practice as a person who grew up pretty much away from their homelands, and using the you know, Halloween style ghost costume, it felt like a really like a boiled down version of what I wanted to talk about, like bare bones of like being in a liminal space and existing and not existing, or existing on somebody else's lands, and also like putting a little bit of humor in there of like, this is a grown-ass person just like been waiting for the train in a ghost costume. And like, I love this one because you could see this like person to the side being like, what in the world is happening? So I did the first iteration in Calgary, or Mohkinstsis, during art school, and that's sort of when I, you know, started to think a lot more about being Inuk and existing in like a super white communities of like, I don't know, Edmonton and Calgary. It's like, especially in Calgary, you don't really see too many Indigenous folks like out and about. So that was also like another thing to contend with. So these, in 2018, I sort of restaged the ghost photos when I was able to go to Inuvik. I hadn't been back for 20 years, probably. I was able to go because of a residency. So it kind of felt like sort of a bookend to take ghost photos up north. This was a lot of fun too. Like there's a lot of outtakes where there's like, I don't know, people in the community walking by, and it's just like so lovely and so funny and so beautiful to have their reaction captured. But it was all like no negative reactions, just like, boy, what you're doing, like you're so goofy. But yeah, it felt super fitting to be able to reenact the ghost in my home territories, because it also felt like, you know, because I was so disconnected from these lands, that I still felt sort of out of place, because it's like, you know, you've been plucked away for so long that it's that whole thing of like, you're too white to be Inuk, or you're too Inuk to be white, like that sort of dialogue. But I think after these photos, I started to think a lot more about like how to talk about work, and how to talk about being like an Inuk artist without centering trauma. And so I wanted to like, this was like a series that I thought about for a long time. Biliutiaka. I made these in 2020. And like in my mind, they're almost another version of the ghost photos of this like performative photography. So it's like, again, thinking about like the fetishization of Inuit, especially like assigned female at birth folks, and like the colonial gaze, the male gaze. And I wanted to confront that directly, but also in a way that's like, again, like kind of humorous, of like this super like -50 parka in this beautiful spring weather. And the props of the sugar and the flour, I was thinking a lot about the introduction of non-native foods into our communities, and how these essentially now they're staples, but they're foreign to us. Just like, you know, bannock is a staple, but it's also like a foreign food. It's colonizer food that we sort of took ownership of. But when I was making these, everyone was like, "Oh, I don't understand why you're having all this sugar in the flour." And it's like, boy, I guess I really have to explain things, because in my head it just makes sense to be like, I don't know, rubber boots, lingerie, sugar, flour, parka, prairies. But I think it was like a really fun way to tie all these subjects together in a photo series. And I haven't really talked about this public art piece a lot. I just like, again, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, I guess I should probably explain it and talk about it. But a couple years ago, I was invited by Caitlin Brown and Wayne Garrett. Ooh, I hope I got their names right. But this is part of their project called The Wandering Island. They made a beautiful website, amazing documentary. There was a couple of artists who were invited to make permanent public art. And they wanted, like, they were familiar with my stone carving practice. So they were suggesting something to do with stones. So we landed on the idea of like stepping stones across the river. And for a long time, I kind of wrestled with this project because I was like, I didn't feel comfortable making a permanent public artwork on land that wasn't my own. And so I was like, how do I reconcile, you know, basically settling my artwork onto like Treaty 7 territory. So I kind of wrestled with it, and I was like, just I wanted to bring it something a little bit more universal and talk about like basically the idea of personifying water. And so I came up, I think there was 10 phrases in total that are essentially what the title says, things that both a relative you haven't seen in a long time and the river could say. So this is a screenshot from the website where they are much more articulate. It talks about sort of the inception of where I came from in my thinking. So yeah, I always try to like make my works open enough so people could inject themselves into it or project themselves onto it, and while also making it super specific, so I could just be like an emotional wreck and be like, look at my soul, let me show you, and then have it both ways of like public and private. But here are installation shots of these beautiful stones. So yeah, they're some are in English and some are in Inuvialuktun. But yeah, I was thinking a lot about like what would like when I was back in Inuvik, like what would people say to me that, I don't know, that the water would say to you as well, like and like I was thinking a lot about my friends' practices too. Like Nicole Kelly Westman has like such a beautiful, tender way of working with language, and yeah, I wanted to try to emulate that in a way, or like think about how I could incorporate that while also, you know, acknowledging the fact that this is not my home territory. So that was part of the planning, just like writing it out in my handwriting. And then these were all of the texts that I don't think they printed the whole gamut, the whole 10 of them or whatever, but that's sort of the same sort of what I was thinking about, you know, the river and your relatives. So that is all I had prepared. So I'll stop doing the screen sharing. Did it work?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Kablusiak.
so beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. Such beautiful presentations that have me really sitting with all of these, yeah, emotional, deeply felt, strength-based responses to the ways in which land is held, maybe I'll say that, held and carried in each of your works differently, but maybe one thing I see commonly across is with such care that you're either relating story or experience or a kind of sitting with, like being with the land as opposed to land as subject. We have a chance now to talk a bit amongst ourselves, and I wanted to pose a kind of prompt, question, and we can all just weigh in and or propose other prompts and questions. But I'm thinking through all of your presentations a bit about the different roles that land can play. And I use this term, we're using this term land, which of course is both very, very broad, too broad in ways, and also very, very specific in each of the instances that you all talked about. But within that, do we, or can we, or how do we see the role of the land in our creative work? I think about land as collaborator, land as teacher, land as elder, and maybe there's other kinds of personified Kablusiak or anthropomorphized or something. Although I tend to think of those terms as ways in which the reality of good relations with non-human and with the land are sort of treated very differently in the English language. But yeah, thinking about the role that that land plays in your work, and we heard a bit about that in your presentations, and I just wonder, yeah, if we can just discuss that in our larger group. And it's open to anyone.
I think land is all of that, and everything that you've said, teacher, elder, friend, but I think most of all as a healing element, because when you're out on the land, there's so much that happens within your body and your mind, and in every way, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically, anytime you're out on the land, which I hope more people could do all the time, because it's so healing. And I think that's what keeps us going, is being out on the land. And your works are so incredibly beautiful, like Tanya, yours, you start reflecting within and thinking about these poetry and words, and then you have Kablusiak so bold and so strong and so wide open, and it's just amazing. Just love all this beautiful works. So thankful to be here right now and to see your works.
Yeah, I'm also really grateful to be in conversation. I just feel like it's really remarkable to see the different ways in which the kind of poetics of each of our practices, it's there. And I think that has to do with our relationships, which are complex and dynamic and lived and different, and yet they're certainly, I think, a shared concern. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how because my work is mostly about embodiment and it comes from that place, usually first and foremost, I've been thinking about how when we work with imagery of the land, and when we're in relation to the land or water, how it gives us a more expansive way of being. And so that for me is kind of one of the things that was sort of at the center of that work, this moment in endurance to the end forever, that I showed, was thinking about the sun in our hearts, thinking about air, and how it so each of the dancers sort of addressed this idea of atmospheres or air in a different way. One of them was in relation to rock, and how does that change sort of air currents or how air moves, and the other was in relation to water. And so I guess that's like a part of my practice, is like when we think about our homelands, all of the things that you've said, these are all the ways in which I think of our relative. But also when we bring when we also sort of meditate on that land interiorly. I don't know if that's a word. I don't think that's a word, but
It's a word.
inward, that we have a more expanded sense of self also, right? Or sense of being. So I guess I just want to offer that, and also laughter.
We can do what we will with those English.
I keep thinking too, because I grew up in Alberta and sort of away from the homelands, to me it feels sometimes like romanticized, and like the idea of land becomes like this like lofty, utopia, and it just like it feels like a what's that word? I can't think of that word when you're reality check. It was like a reality check when I went up north. When I was in Inuvik, I was able to go to Tuk for just overnight, and my uncle was driving and showing me around to all these places, and I was like trying to be all like emotional and whatever, and I was like, I am being attacked by mosquitoes. I can't even focus on a word that he was saying because I was getting chewn up alive. And I'm like, okay, this is it. This is the land. This is what you wanted this whole time, bitch. You better soak it up. But I was just like getting chewed up by mosquitoes. I'm like, oh my God, like this is not my utopia of like what my homeland is.
Yeah, I think it's good to point to, right? Like there are such deeply felt relations, and then there are also the realities, right, of being weathered, as you kind of alluded to, Tanya. But it's like simultaneously as we're being weathered in many different kinds of contexts, there's also that we're simultaneously being held or something. I'm thinking about that really beautiful message in your work, Kablusiak, where I remember holding you when you were young, and this way that the river could say that and a relative could say that, I think. Beautiful association. And then I'm also thinking in that spirit of collaboration, Maureen, how you talked about the layers of ice building up and dragging back those spare rugs so that they pointed upwards to the sky, and that moment where maybe there's some kind of surrender in a way to the realities of the ways in which the land influences or shapes us as much as we think we're in charge most of the time.
Or reclaims. It always does, right? The land always takes back then becomes richer. But yes, the stepping stones and those memories are so beautiful and respectful, and and not saying yes to big public artworks, but just being very gentle and very mindful and very respectful, that it held everything, the water and the people and the memories, just really thoughtful. So proud. Yeah.
In terms of like the realities too, I know what you're saying, Kablusiak, because we're like super practical people where I'm from. Like, we have these sort of philosophical, I think, sort of ideas about the land, our old beliefs, and then of course we have to sort of, in an ongoing way, be in relation to the weather, which is always changing, and which you can't leave home. Like my family lives in a really tiny village where I'm from, and you can't travel, and it actually creates Like it's a real, it really affects your life, you know, on a daily basis, because it determines whether or not you can go on the water, whether or not you can, you know, go out for a walk even, depending on the winds and the storms. And then there are those moments where it's just everything gets really calm and beautiful, and it's probably when it's utopic, you know, in those moments where, you know, the sun is a certain way, or the clouds, or the water, and you know, but I think that's what I try to say is, so often now we live in these weather repellent ways, you know, in air conditioning, but also we're trying to repel weather. We're trying to suspend time. We're trying to keep things preserved. Lots, you know, whether that's our belongings in museums or otherwise. And so I guess that's why I'm sort of embracing this idea of weather and the complexities of what that can mean. But I love how you bring it back to like that experience too. You know, like what's it like? There are moments where you feel these like incredible sort of connections, and you feel that healing. You feel that. And then there are moments where you're being chewed alive by the mosquitoes en masse.
Yeah, I think that idea of weathering, or, you know, and of course the current and critical moment of climate and climate change and how that's affecting us. I think about that as another kind of, you know, pointer. And I wanted to revisit Maureen and ask you just maybe just for another bit of addressing the new work that you showed, the Red Cross on the ice. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about that as a signal. Just to, I'm sort of thinking about all our discussion today, and also the necessariness of addressing the current and critical moment as well, in terms of, like you mentioned, people having to move their homes, the shores starting to creep up, and the realities of that shift in climate. And I'm thinking particularly about that recent work.
I think it's something that the youth are really aware of now, today, at this time, because you know, like their film Happening to Us, it really draws attention to this area and what climate change is doing and what can we do. You know, they traveled to Spain to speak on climate change, and you know, every time you can speak to the world, to let them know like what's happening in your own homelands, I think it's, any way you can help is a really good thing. And whether it brings in more funding for moving the community, or building up infrastructure, or building up the roads, or creating barriers, you know, or what do you call those walkways out into the ocean? There's one in Alaska and Nome. Those breakwaters. You know, if you can get funding for things like that, that would help our communities. So that's what I was trying to bring awareness about, was like, we need your help. You know, we are in a crisis. Our community is eroding very, very quickly. So yeah, having the youth speak about it and include it hopefully in their little film, because I think art as activism is a very powerful thing.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Kukjam, Kainani. I want to thank all of you for your offering today. We are reaching our time, so I do want to conclude in a good way by offering thanks and respect for all that you shared with us. I also want to ask those who have joined us in watching this discussion to continue to think about how we engage with our lands, whose lands we're on, what are our connections, what acts of resistance can engaging with the land carry, and what acts of futurity can caring and expressing continue to offer at this critical time. So thank you again, all of you. It's been such a really moving and powerful discussion, as I continue to be a fan and find such incredible inspiration in all of your work. So thank you very much for joining us here.
Communion.